Before we start the 1940s, I would like to raise my glass to the following people. To Bill Finger, the unmentioned scripter of Detective Comics number 27, the first appearance of Batman. To MLJ Comics for putting out Pep Comics, which was the debut of Archie. To all the packagers, especially Will Eisner, Jerry Eager, Busy Arnold, Harry Chesler, Victor Fox, and to anyone who made a comic in 1939, you made it! The 1940s should be remembered as a good time for superheroes because All American comes out and starts putting out superheroes. Timely Comics comes out putting out superheroes, which had used Funnies Incorporated. Like Martin Goodman hired them to put out a comic, and the first comic they put out, I believe, is called Marvel Comics Magazine, I think. It was Marvel Comics. Good name, Marvel Comics. I'm sure we'll hear it again sometime. But the thing to do in 1940s was to work, because soon enough you'll be over there, over there, over there, and then you'll be there. How's that song go? But because World War II hits on December 7th, 1941. After years of not being in it, after years of German expansion and people appeasing the Germans, the United States gets involved when the Japanese attack. In another video, in another time, I'll tell you about the people that served, the cartoonists, the writers. I'll tell you about the other people, the people that did propaganda, the cartoonists that got held over by the Germans in France and Belgium. I'll tell you about the Japanese propagandists. I'll tell you about the people that didn't make it back. But I can't tell you about it now because that's too long of a time and I don't have the material to do it justice. But onwards. At the end of the war, Max Gaines leaves All American. He saves one thing, Bible stories, for his own company, Educational Comics. He takes Bible stories with him. He sells to Jack Leibowitz his paper contracts because in World War II, any prior existing publisher would get paper at the exact same price pre-war. But if you started during the war, you had to pay more, or you didn't get any at all. So Gaines goes off and starts Educational Comics, EC for short. He dies later, tragically. He manages to get into a boating accident with a oncoming boater, and at the last minute of his life he takes the kid that was riding with him and throws him into the back of the boat, saving his life. Not a bad way to go out. But Gaines' son, William Gaines, takes over the family business. And William will go on to publish Two-Fisted Tales, Mad Comics, horror stories. Horror stories is what EC is known for today, and they're good. Like, they have the best artists around. Like, they didn't have a house style like at All-American one time, Sheldon Moldoff tells a story about he got put on Hawkman, and they told him, copy Chuck Ciodera's work. Like, do it the way Chuck Ciodera would ink it. And he did. But at EC, diversity was encouraged. When they encouraged diversity, it gathered so many fans, and it sold. They definitely sold. Now, on the other fronts, things were doing pretty well, actually. Ladies and gentlemen, these two men were DC Comics' Silver Age editors. Despite getting their starts in the early 40s, it wasn't until the 50s and 60s that these two men started to make their mark. Their names are Mort Weisinger and Julius Schwartz. Mort Weisinger worked for DC Comics. Basically, he's remembered for two things. One, for being the most, shall we say, unpleasant person to deal with, and also for having some of the most pleasant Superman stories produced under his editorialship. Weisinger and colleague Julius Schwartz would meet in the 1930s and start a publication called The Time Traveler. The Time Traveler was a science fiction fandom magazine that would inspire Jerry Siegel, the future creator of Superman, to come up with his own science fiction magazine. Weisinger and Schwartz would eventually become literary agents for such writers as H.P. Lovecraft. Before going into World War II, Weisinger would work at DC Comics, where he created Green Arrow and Aquaman. While both men had started out at All-American, Schwartz would take over the All-American characters, and Weisinger would take over the National Comics Superman line for DC Comics. Julius Schwartz was every artist's favorite editor. Julius Schwartz would take cover ideas, and he would have these covers commissioned, and then he would take these covers and have a writer come up with a story based on that cover. Julius Schwartz was the editor who had a hand in reviving many of DC's superhero lines, including Batman. Mort Weisinger would retire from DC Comics in 1970. Julius Schwartz would retire from DC Comics in 1986. Comics is not a worldwide term. Comics is an American term. It's an English term. In Britain, it's called comics. In America, it's called comics. However, in Argentina, it's called historietas. In Japan, it's manga. In Korea, it's manhwa. It's manhua in China. It's fumetti in Italian. It's bande dessinées in France or France. Philippines, it's comics. The K. Let me begin by saying that World War II was probably one of the most influential events in the 20th century. It was especially influential in the comic book industry. Now, several key publishers decided not to put their publishers in the war because America was still an isolationist state at the time, up until December 7th, 1941. However, the first thing you think of is Superman fighting Nazis and the Japanese when you think of when comics did enter the war. The All-Star Comics put their heroes up against the Nazis and the Germans. Superman especially could be seen on covers helping soldiers out. He could be seen with the flag for truth, justice, and the American way. In fact, up until the war, I would imagine, Hirohito's favorite cartoon was Superman. But Superman was kept out of the war primarily because of readership interest. However, one must ask, if Superman enters the war, how come the war wasn't over so quickly in the books? So it was that kind of role it had to play. Other comic book publishers like Lev Gleason's Daredevil took on the Axis powers, as did Fawcett's Comics with their own Captain Marvel versus Captain Nazi. Captain America was created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. It's an interesting side note, because the Nazis had support in America for a long time, Mayor LaGuardia actually offered them protection. Jack Kirby would eventually work with this young man, Sergeant Lieber, who is now known as Stan Lee. Stan Lee served as a trainer, whereas Jack Kirby fought on the lines. An interesting note about the government and role in this time period of cartoons is that they actually stopped a Superman newspaper strip from having certain content. Now, the writers of this particular strip had a issue of Popular Mechanics that dealt with the cyclotron or atom smasher. Basically, atomic physics was at work, and the government, the Department of Defense, stepped in and said that the storyline was getting too close for comfort for them. So they ended up contacting Jack Leibowitz, Harry Donenfeld, and they had the cartoon ghosted by other people so that the storyline ended. An interesting note about Japanese mangaka was one cartoonist named Taro Yoshima, who worked for the OSS on the American side. He developed a comic book story, about a peasant soldier that died in battle for the Japanese. His son was actually Mako, a famous actor. But back to the Japanese, there were other cartoonists that emphasized the strong imperialist, nationalistic pride of the Japanese, such as Tagawa and Yokoyama. On the French side, you have men like Hergé having to end up leaving their work when the Germans invaded and starting with the German-occupied papers on a new story. The Germans had interesting propaganda portraying them as ideal youths. They had gentlemen, good-natured people. They had a lot of propaganda that made them look out to be better. And they also had a lot of propaganda that made Jews especially seem lesser, and other nations seem lesser, as you can see here with the German Shepherd is tethered. However, there was a lot of escapist work going on at the same time, but Hitler was a target for political cartoons especially. But it's interesting to note how many people served on the American side, like Dan DeCarlo, who created Betty and Veronica and a lot of the Archie creations, and Josie the Pussycat. Milton Caniff actually had a strip called Mail Call, and that was dedicated to the soldiers of the war, and it only ran during the war years in GI newspapers. Then you have guys that Jack Davis served his country as well. Al Cap, on the other hand, was missing a leg since age 9, so he ended up donating his time to people who were wounded. Charles Schulz served in the war. Ben Oda actually served in the war as a paratrooper, and he was a Japanese-American, whereas Bill Yoshida actually was in an American internment camp for the Japanese. Well, to those I did not mention, to those that did not make it back, here's to you.